Your father once bought land in your name. A relative has. Watch fast. My beloved child, hear this like a heartbeat rising in your ears and do not blink because each second holds a decision that shapes your future. The air is charged like a storm about to break and the truth stands at your doorway with muddy shoes. Tonight a quiet secret stops being quiet and it starts speaking your name out loud. The story opens with a rusted trunk under your father's old bed and the scent of ink and dust folds into the room like memory. There is a file wrapped in red thread, edges browned by time yet stubborn with purpose. Paper does not shout like people shout, but these pages carry a thunder of their own. Your father bought land in your name long ago when you were still learning to spell your signature. He did it with a smile that lit the entire courtyard and the promise that one day your footing in this world would be unshakable. He called it your anchor and he tied it to your destiny with simple faith and a stamp. Years passed and people changed while the plot sat under the same sun with the same wind and the same slow grass. Boundaries were marked by stones, not loud, not bright, just steady, and your father would visit and tap each stone like counting blessings. Then life pulled him in many directions and time layered itself the way dust layers over idols. In another home, a relative watched the same sun but felt a different hunger. Greed grows in quiet corners the way mold grows behind old curtains and no one notices until the stench travels. This person measured your future with a ruler of envy and whispered plans into a phone that glowed in the dark. They studied the gaps in your routine and the softness of your trust. They learned the shape of your signature the way a thief learns the shape of a key. They told themselves that taking what is yours would not be theft if they called it fate. It started with a photocopy and a mouth that knew how to sound honest. Pages can be forged the way a story can be rehearsed, and they stitched a narrative with thread made of lies. A line was drawn where it did not belong and ink pretended to be your hand. At an office with tired fans and tea stains on the desk, a clerk flipped through forms while noon light burned the floor. The relative smiled and placed documents down like cards in a game they expected to win. A date was chosen, a number was assigned, and mischief put on the clothes of procedure. But the angels that walk with your name do not sleep when a plan like this moves near your door. Protection does not always roar like thunder, sometimes it taps like a pebble at the window. The first tap came as a casual remark from a neighbor who had no reason to mention land yet mentioned it anyway. You felt a pinch at the edge of your day as if your name had been called by a stranger across a crowded market. Something in your chest turned and looked toward the past. You remembered your father's hand on your shoulder and the way he said that anchors only work if you know where you tied them. That evening you opened the old trunk with the red thread, and the dust lifted like a curtain. Inside, the sale deed lay calm, a river of words rushing between margins, seals pressed like coins against the paper. You traced the seal with your fingertip and felt the temperature of responsibility rise in your veins. You spread the papers on the floor and the map of the plot looked back at you like a quiet face waiting to be recognized. The survey number sat there like a heart number that never changes. The witness names were men who laughed with your father in another decade and you could almost hear them clearing their throats. The next day you walked into a room where the air smelled like ink, metal clips, and stale promises. Lines of people told 1,000 small tragedies and victories with files clutched to their chests. When your turn came, Your voice did not tremble because memory had become your spine. You requested the latest record of rights, and the clerk lifted his eyes as if noticing a storm cloud forming. He typed your name and the system blinked like a nervous eyelid. What appeared on the screen made your jaw harden because a new line had crept into your story without your consent. A mutation entry was pending, fresh as wet paint, and the date did not belong to you. The relative had drawn a path to your inheritance and tried to walk it before you woke. They had used a signature that wore your face like a cheap mask. You felt anger rise like fire, but you held it the way a blacksmith holds iron in tongs. Fire must be used to forge, not to burn the whole house. You breathed and remembered how your father always spoke of patience as a weapon sharper than any blade. You collected certified copies like gathering arrows before a battle. Each page was an arrowhead, clean and undeniable, meant to fly straight. You asked for the application log and the receipt trail because footprints always betray the direction of a thief. Back home, you created a timeline because time is a net that catches lies. You wrote the day your father purchased the land, the day of registration, the day of mutation in your favor, and the day of the suspicious application. You marked the gaps and the overlaps until patterns began to talk. You compared your real signature with the forged one and observed the hesitation in the strokes that tried to mimic your hand. Where your real line rose with confidence, the false line twitched with greed. Letters tell the truth like voices tremble when the room goes silent. Another tap came at the window of your day in the form of an envelope without a return address. Inside were low-quality photocopies and a sticky note with a single sentence that tasted like warning. Someone who still remembers your father had decided to fight alongside you from the shadows. You visited the land at dawn when the sky is a pale promise and the earth decides which stories to allow. The boundary stones were still there, but one had been nudged, not far, just enough to test your attention. You pushed it back with your foot and felt the ground align itself with your resolve. A watchman from a nearby farm pointed toward the road with a chin movement that meant trouble had passed recently. He spoke of a motorbike stopping, of a man making calls, of eyes scanning the plot like a measuring tape. He recalled a laugh that sounded practiced and a bag that looked official. You went to a lawyer who listens more than he speaks and measures words the way a goldsmith measures weight. He read your file and looked at you the way one looks at a person who has done the brave part already. He circled dates and underlined names and said that paper can be a sword if handled by steady hands. A legal notice was drafted like thunder writes itself across the sky. The tone was not begging, it was the weight of a bell rung in a temple at dawn. It listed sections and obligations and demanded a reply that could not hide behind small talk. Copies were sent by registered post because truth moves with receipts and acknowledgments. Another set went to the office where the mutation was pending, marked with a request to halt until verification. Authority, when reminded that it is being watched, often remembers its first duty. You began to keep a diary of events because memory is clearer when it wears ink. You wrote the time of each call, the name of each person, the mood of each room, the smell of each corridor. This diary became a mirror that forced every face to look at itself. The relative grew impatient because greed hates delay. They made another move, small but reckless, a phone call to someone who prefers quiet deals. What they did not know is that some people who prefer quiet deals also prefer to sleep at night without stones on their hearts. A call reached you from an unexpected friend who had once shared tea with your father on a summer afternoon. He said a line that warmed your blood like a lamp in a cold corridor. He said that truth arrives eventually, and today it chose your address. With patience as armor, you walked back into the office where files live longer than trees. You requested a handwriting verification because science enjoys proving liars wrong. Your sample was taken properly while the forged sample stood beside it like a shadow pretending to be shape. The report did not scream, it simply placed facts on the table the way morning places light on a floor. The slant of letters told their quiet tale and the pressure points confessed their crime. The conclusion sat there like a final drumbeat after a long march. The pending mutation was frozen like water in winter. The relative found the friendly doors turning into walls. Those who had offered easy passage stepped aside because no one wants to be photographed with someone who tripped over a bright lamp of evidence. You made one more visit to the land, and this time you did not arrive alone. You brought a surveyor with instruments that blink and beep like small, honest stars. Measurements were read and recorded, and the earth nodded as if grateful to be mapped by truth. There was a moment when the wind rose and the trees tossed their leaves like confetti for a shy celebration. You felt your father's hand on your shoulder again, not as memory but as a promise kept. The stones around the plot seemed to sit taller, proud of their straight spines. The relative tried to call and tried to sound like family again. They used old nicknames and old stories and the sticky sweetness of nostalgia to soften your guard. You listened without anger and without permission for the past to erase the present. You spoke with the steadiness that only comes after a person has walked through smoke and learned how not to cough. You said that love without respect is a locked gate, and that apology without repair is a cup without water. You said that paper now carries the truth and the truth now carries you. You did not seek revenge because revenge is a grip that cramps the hand. You sought order, and order is the ground where future homes are built. The file was updated, the records were corrected, and the circle was closed without leaving a stain. At dusk you placed the original deed back in the red thread jacket and tied the knot like sealing a vow. The trunk went under the bed again, but it did not feel like hiding, it felt like resting. You smiled at the way responsibility can sleep once it trusts the one keeping watch. Days later you stood at the edge of the plot and watched children chase a kite across the open stretch. The land felt alive in the way a drum feels alive under a sure hand. You realized that inheritance is not just earth and paper, it is the courage to guard what carries your name. You set up a small board at the corner with your name clear and the survey number like a spine beneath it. Clarity is a lantern that makes even thieves prefer another street. The watchman waved from the distance and you waved back as if saluting a fellow soldier. There is a calm that comes after the right storm, a silence that is not empty but fulfilled. You breathed that air and felt your chest widen the way a door widens when it chooses welcome. The future stood nearby with its bag of seasons and waited for you to lead. Remember this lesson the way a sailor remembers the lighthouse pattern. Keep certified copies where light can find them quickly. Keep a timeline that can stand in court even if your voice shakes, and keep allies close who still respect the sound of your father's name. When temptation returns to any heart around you, let this story travel ahead like a guard with steady boots. Truth is not fragile when cared for with routine and attention. A name becomes a fortress when it is written with honor and defended with patience. Tonight, let your home rest knowing the anchor your father tied did not drift. Let the floor feel strong under your feet and the walls feel friendly around your sleep. Let your name sit upright in the records where it was meant to sit from the beginning. Tomorrow, walk with quiet authority and let your work speak before your mouth does. Shake hands when it is safe, step aside when it is wise, and draw lines when it is necessary. Keep the red thread close because some things deserve to be tied tightly. Your father's faith has proved itself like a seed that kept a secret sprout for the right season. The plot will hold memories of harvests, celebrations, and the kind of laughter that echoes without needing help. The stones will remember your footsteps and tell the wind that you came and stood and stayed. This is how a stolen future is taken back without breaking your own heart. This is how a name remains clean even after someone tried to stain it with hurried ink. This is how you honor a promise made in a courtyard long ago beneath a patient sky. The night closes with a soft click and your story breathes evenly again. The clock no longer races because truth does not sprint when it has won. You turn off the last light with a hand that knows its strength and a mind that knows its peace. And if this message guarded your heart, protected your name, and helped you secure what your father set aside for you, remember that your support keeps these lights burning for others who are still walking through the storm. My beloved child, the days that followed felt like the sky leaning closer to listen, as if the horizon itself wanted to witness your steadiness. Morning light poured through your window like a promise with its sleeves rolled up. Every step you took sounded like the echo of your father's faith returning home. A whisper traveled through the town that the mutation was frozen and the papers were cooling like iron removed from flame. Shops repeated it the way sparrows repeat news across wires. The relative heard it and their laughter lost its rehearsal. They tried to gather sympathy the way one gathers dry leaves, quick and noisy but easy to scatter with a single gust. Old stories were pulled out like borrowed blankets, but none of them were warm enough to cover the cold truth. People who had nodded along earlier began to stare at their shoes. You did not gloat because victory that arrives with clean hands does not require a drum. You simply continued the work of setting things straight. Your silence felt like a courtroom where the facts stand without shouting. A visit to the Tahsildar's office was next, corridors lined with files that remembered 1,000 family trees. The Tahsildar read your application with the patience of someone measuring rain in a clay cup. He stamped the halt order again, firm as a heel on uneven ground. You asked for an encumbrance certificate and it arrived like a mirror that refused to show borrowed faces. Page after page wore your name the way a river wears its bed. Nothing outside the rightful entries dared to appear. The Patvari traced the boundary on a fresh sheet and his pen flowed like a river mapping its own truth. Coordinates were written like beads on a string, each one tightening the necklace around your rightful claim. The village headman signed with a nod that carried decades of dust and wisdom. At dusk you returned to the plot with the surveyor, and the beeping instrument sounded like a small heartbeat at your feet. The earth liked the attention and the numbers rose true as stars. A new map was born like a child who looks like both parents and destiny. The relative sent a message asking for a meeting in a tea stall with chairs that wobbled slightly on their legs. They arrived wearing concern on their face the way a stage actor wears makeup in the wrong scene. Their eyes slid across the table like spoons looking for sugar that wasn't there. You listened with a stillness that made every excuse sound louder than it hoped to sound. Family was repeated like a prayer half remembered. Forgiveness was asked the way a person reaches for a key that never belonged to them. You spoke about repair and responsibility the way a mason speaks about plaster and brick. Words were laid carefully, not to trap, but to build the shape of a boundary that would not move again. The bill for damages was simple and it was paid in the currency of setting records right. A public notice went to the newspaper, and its thin black letters marched across the page like a small army with shining boots. It warned against any transaction without your written consent, and it stood at the town's attention board like a guard that never blinks. People read it between sips of tea and nodded as if they recognized a familiar star. You placed a board on the land corner, the lettering clean and the survey number lined like a spine. The paint dried in the sun and the wind tested it for patience. It did not peel because truth makes good paint last longer than seasons. A new folder was made at home with plastic sleeves and soft edges that never cut fingers. You filed the deed, the map, the certificates, and the halted mutation order, each one in its own pocket like children in their classroom chairs. The folder closed with a click that sounded like a latch choosing piece. Word reached a small office where a fixer had once promised shortcuts. He now advised silence because shortcuts collapse under the weight of firm steps. No one wanted to be seen on the side that didn't hold. Another week rolled by and the land began to look like a project instead of a secret. You planted 2 saplings at the entrance and watered them with the care of someone sealing a promise in green. The soil darkened happily and swallowed the water like gratitude. You spoke to a contractor about a boundary wall that would be plain but straight. He measured with his tape and marked with chalk while you marked your future with calm breath. Cement arrived like sacks of certainty waiting to be mixed with patience. Bricks formed a ribbon along the edges and every tap of the trowel sounded like a syllable of your father's name. Workers laughed between lifts and sweat glistened like honesty under the sun. A clean corner for a small gate was left open with intention. My beloved child, the gate arrived on a truck with a slight squeak that sounded eager to serve. It was painted a color the day could love and the night could respect. When it swung on its hinges, even the road seemed to pause and nod. A notebook of expenses lived in your pocket and numbers sat there like well-behaved guests. Each line reminded you that diligence is not noise but rhythm. No rupee left the page without a witness. The relative tried one last time through someone dressed like an apology. They asked for a share in a story where they had only written trouble. You answered with a document that did not blink and a silence that did not bend. They realized then that you did not carry anger, only alignment. Alignment is heavier than rage because it carries the exact weight of truth. They stepped back because truth fills a room and pushes the chairs into their proper places. The harvest season approached and the saplings leaned into the wind like children growing bold. You visited at dawn and watched a kite hover above the boundary as if drawing a second wall in the sky. The ground smelled like tomorrow graduates. An old friend of your father came by with a steel tiffin and 2 cups. He placed them on the half-built platform and smiled in the language of men who remember simple goals. He said your father would have stood exactly where you were standing and tilted his head exactly that way. You felt your chest warm the way lamps warm old photographs. The friend pointed at the corner where the first brick was laid and tapped it with his knuckles as if greeting an old soldier. He said some promises keep themselves alive by finding the right hands to hold them. The boundary wall reached its final line and the mason smoothed the last curve like a signature written without hurry. A ribbon of whitewash passed across the length and left quiet pride behind. The gate locked with a polite click and the key sat in your palm like a medal. You took photocopies of the completed file and stored them in 2 different places because preparedness multiples peace. A small digital backup sat on a clean drive with labels that even sleep could read. Redundancy hugged you like an extra blanket on a night the wind has new ideas. News of your care reached people who had been quiet witnesses to other families' storms. They admired not just the win but the method, not just the proof but the pace. Your name began to change flavor in the town, less like a topic and more like a standard. The relative vanished into ordinary days the way a ripple fades after meeting a rock. Their phone calls turned into messages, and the messages turned into silence that learned manners. You did not celebrate their silence, you celebrated your order. A small storage shed went up inside the corner and its tin roof rattled happily during the first light rain. The sound did not worry you because your paperwork had become the umbrella rain respects. You stood inside the shed and felt no leak above you and no gap beneath you. You began to dream of a home office that would face the sunrise, a desk where decisions could unfold like clean clothes. On that desk a photograph of your father would sit with a view of the 2 saplings growing their private agenda. The thought alone rearranged your heartbeat into a calmer drum. Friends asked how you stayed so composed and you answered with habits not slogans. Early copies, dated notes, calm visits, and never walking alone into a room where others brought shadows. You carried daylight the way some people carry umbrellas, ready even when the sky acts polite. My beloved child, your steps now are the same steps that once trembled while approaching the first counter. They are simply more certain because certainty lives in what you keep doing, not in what you keep saying. The road ahead looks long and friendly because you kept it swept. You made a small ritual of touching the boundary stone nearest the gate before leaving. Rituals like that are not superstition, they are memory training in disguise. Your fingers told your mind again and again where you belong. A letter arrived from the registrar's office confirming that the fraudulent application was not just halted but cancelled like a bad play after the first act. The letter used formal words, but they sounded like applause in a well-lit hall. You kept the envelope as carefully as the letter because even the container now meant victory. You visited the lawyer with sweets because gratitude pours best when carried in both hands. He smiled and took one, then folded the box as if filing it in a cheerful drawer. He reminded you that respect is a receipt no one can forge. You walked back through a marketplace where vendors called out prices and children bargained with the logic of little kings. The noise felt like music because your mind was quiet. When the mind is quiet, even a crowd knows how to lean back. At home, the red thread jacket lay on the table like a well-fed cat. You untied it, smiled at the familiar papers, and retied it with a knot that looked practiced and easy. The motion felt like closing a storybook that promises sequels made of peace. Night settled like a shawl and the clock behaved like a friend again. The wind moved through the curtains and did not bring any strange voices with it. You slept without negotiating with shadows. Morning returned with its tray of possibilities and you chose one shaped like growth. A contractor's estimate for a simple room arrived and you measured the numbers with the same patience you used to read the map. Growth, you realized, is happiest when escorted by order. Days layered themselves into a calm staircase and you climbed without missing a step. People now spoke your name in sentences that included stability, clarity, and follow-through. The world did not change, but your position in it found its correct chair. Your father's photo seemed to look slightly more amused, as if the frame had always known this part of the script. Perhaps glass knows when the view in front of it has finally matched the promise behind it. You nodded at the photo as if acknowledging a finished task. The land no longer felt like a secret or a threatened treasure. It felt like a partner with a voice of soil and a memory of boots. You promised it that everything built on it would be honest enough to deserve its strength. Evening softened the edges of everything and the two saplings threw thin shadows that will one day be wide shade. A bird courted the new wall with a quick step and a quick song. You watched and understood that permanence is a family of small, repeated choices. The relative existed somewhere in the town and their story existed somewhere in your past, but neither existed in your chest anymore. You had not broken a bridge. You had simply placed the bridge in its right place over the right river. The river flowed on without needing your supervision. This is how the chapter closes without slamming and opens without squeaking. This is how an anchor becomes a foundation and a foundation becomes a future. This is how a name sits straight in every ledger it enters, including the quiet ledger of your own heart. And if this continuation strengthened your resolve and helped you protect what your father set aside for you, remember that your support keeps these messages reaching others who need them. My beloved child, mornings became a steady drum that kept your courage in time with the sun. The kettle sang like a small herald and calm arrived before the first sip. Your steps moved with the kind of assurance that makes doors remember their hinges. You visited the sub-registrar to collect certified true copies and each stamp landed like a footstep on firm ground. The clerk slid the envelope across the counter and did not look away because clean work likes eye contact. You placed the envelope in your bag the way a captain folds a map before sailing. The Putvar's ledger now carried the corrected entry like a spine that had been straightened. Your name sat in its rightful line and the survey number shone like a constant star. The signature at the bottom looked like a road that knows where it is going. A quiet afternoon found you back at the trunk with the red thread, not for panic but for gratitude. You untied the knot and your fingers moved with the affection of a gardener tending a trusted plant. Between pages a small note from your father waited like a candle that never asks for applause. The note spoke of harvests that would come if patience was watered often. It mentioned your stubbornness as a blessing when shaped by discipline. It ended with a simple instruction to always keep the original safer than your pride. You placed the note in a glass sleeve and slid it next to the deed where both could keep each other company. Memory and law shook hands inside that small pocket. You tied the red thread again with a knot that looked like a promise sitting upright. At the plot, a mason finished a slim platform near the gate for visitors to pause with respect. Whitewash dried under a sun that enjoyed good work. The two young trees fluttered like sleeves ready for ceremony. You ordered a nameplate for the gate that combined steel and silence. When it arrived, the letters stood firm without shouting. The plate caught the light at dawn and returned it without greed. A local electrician came to draw a clean line for a temporary power connection. Wires sat neatly like sentences that know their grammar. When the switch clicked, the room filled with the kind of light that does not argue. A small pucker room began to rise on the far side of the boundary, neither extravagant nor shy. Bricks arranged themselves like disciplined thoughts. Cement cured with the patience of a lesson that understands its student. Your expense notebook kept pace, every figure escorted by a date and a signature. Receipts stacked like a chorus that could sing in any office without clearing its throat. Nothing was left to memory alone because memory appreciates company. The relative retreated into days that did not require cunning. Their greetings in the market lost their borrowed confidence. People listened to them with politeness and with doors already closing. A parcel arrived containing the handwriting expert's full report bound in sober cardboard. The pages walked through each stroke and curve with the calm of a surgeon completing clean work. At the end, the conclusion rested like a stone that does not need a guard. Your lawyer suggested filing a caveat so no surprise could arrive disguised as urgency. The document went in with dates aligned like soldiers at inspection. You exhaled, not from fear, but from the dignity of preparedness. A friend at the bank met you for tea and spoke about a locker for the originals. The locker number felt like a short prayer that requires no sound. You placed the deed inside and kept only the certified copies in your folder, lightening your pockets and deepening your peace. The contractor leveled the courtyard and the soil turned to a smooth brown rug. A path of tiles connected the gate to the room like a sentence connecting subject to meaning. When you walked it, your feet recognized their new routine immediately. A wooden desk found its place by the window and waited for papers and decisions. You placed your father's photograph on the left and a small lamp on the right. The lamp threw a circle that looked like a well of focus. You framed the encumbrance certificate along with the survey sketch and mounted them on the inside wall. Visitors would see truth first and conversation second. The room learned the language of order quickly. My beloved child, the village headman stopped by with a register for your signature confirming boundary completion. He observed the saplings and the clean corners and smiled like a man who enjoys endings that keep opening into better beginnings. His pen moved with the quiet showmanship of a craftsman finishing a familiar flourish. A letter from the Tahsildar affirmed that all future entries on the land would require your physical presence. The sentence felt like a new lock on an old door. You placed a copy on the desk and another in the folder because redundancy is a cousin of wisdom. You met a surveyor again to establish permanent reference points with metal markers set in concrete. Numbers were punched into the plates like coordinates carved into memory. The ground accepted them as if relieved to be heard precisely. In the evenings you began drafting a plan to use a part of the land for something that honored your father. The idea of a scholarship fund took shape like a kite building its frame before catching wind. A notice board would one day carry names of students who walked further because someone believed quietly. Local children played cricket just outside the boundary and their cheers rose like fireworks without smoke. You allowed them to fetch the ball through the gate because good fences do not fear good laughter. Respect traveled both ways and returned every time like a well-trained bird. An accountant audited your file without ceremony and nodded at the neatness. He suggested a will with explicit nomination so the future would never scramble if the sky changed color. The will was drafted, witnessed, registered, and folded into the locker like a shield taking its seat. The relative sent a hesitant message during a festival, wishing you peace in sentences that looked for footing. You replied with a polite blessing and left it there. Politeness can be a wall when laid in straight lines. A light rain washed the courtyard and left footprints of drops drying into gentle proof. The wall did not weep and the gate did not complain. Even the nameplate held its shine as if it knew who it was now. You began keeping a small visitor log at the desk because memory appreciates inked companions. Each entry carried a time, a purpose, and a signature that belonged to the person signing it. The book kept your days stitched together with clear thread. The shed received labeled shelves and a lock that clicked with professional satisfaction. Tools stood upright like citizens at a pledge. Dust learned to stay in corners and behave. My beloved child, the town slowly adopted your method as a story worth retelling. People used your timeline trick to mend their own paperwork. A clerk mentioned that your file had become a reference example whispered in corridors where integrity still enjoys unexpected company. The trees put out new leaves like shy flags. You watered them without drama and the soil accepted the gesture without fuss. Growth often prefers plain applause. You sponsored a streetlight installation near the corner where the road dips into dimness. The light settled into the night like a lighthouse in miniature. Strangers walked safer and gratitude drifted toward your gate without needing to knock. A carpenter fitted a modest bench under the tree line facing the gate. The bench taught passing shoulders to relax and taught gossip to sit with better posture. Even the wind took a slower breath when it passed. Your father's friend returned with a story about the day the land was chosen. He described how your father tested the soil with his palm and smiled at its firmness. He said your father spoke your name softly and it sounded like a key turning in a lock that had already decided to open. You felt the room widen without changing size. Legacy is a layout that rearranges the air. You placed a second frame beside the first, this one holding a single line from your father's note, written in his own hand. A community meeting formed at the edge of the plot to discuss drainage after heavy rains. You offered a simple trench and a shared budget sheet with clear columns. People agreed faster because math and manners sat side by side. The trench was dug and the first rain afterward ran along it like a disciplined river. No puddles sulked in corners and no argument followed the downpour. The village slept with one less worry pacing in its courtyard. A local teacher asked if her students could visit for a lesson on how land records work. You nodded and set the desk with copies and markers. The children listened with the kind of stillness that looks like respect wearing brand new shoes. They learned about survey numbers, mutations, encumbrances, and the dignity of receipts. Their notebooks filled with clean lines and practical words. They left with a wave that felt like a small festival passing your gate. Your days adopted a shape that welcomed surprise only when it arrived with a receipt. Even celebrations were audited by gratitude. The sky seemed taller because your shoulders finally carried the correct load. One morning, a certificate for the streetlight contribution arrived with a crisp seal. You filed it under Community, a section that was empty before and now promised to grow. Folders like that teach the heart new alphabets. An old notary who had once looked the other way sent a quiet apology through a mutual acquaintance. You accepted it without opening old rooms. Closure sometimes bows with its hat on and leaves gracefully. My beloved child, the sapling's roots found their confidence and the leaves learned a darker green. The courtyard gained a habit of shade in the late afternoon. The bench discovered stories that require no names. You prepared a festival evening where lamps would run along the boundary like a garland of calm. Friends and neighbors gathered without being asked twice. The first lamp lit easily and the second learned quickly. A small speech rose from your chest without needing paper. You spoke of patience, paperwork, and long breaths that outlast mischief. Each sentence thanked your father without using the word thank you because the lamp already knew what to say. When the lamps reflected in your father's framed photo, the glass looked like it had learned the art of smiling. The gate remained open for a while, then closed with a sound that resembled contentment. The key rested in your pocket like a familiar handshake. Night folded itself with tidy corners and your feet knew the path to the door even in gentle darkness. Inside, the red thread jacket slept in the locker and did not miss you. You slept in your own bed and did not miss alarms. The future waits like a respectful guest on a chair near the window. It watches your daily rituals and understands the rules of this house. It knows it will be welcomed in the order it deserves. And if this continuation deepened your strength and steadied your steps, remember that these words keep traveling because you help them find the next door. If you wish to express your support further, you have the option to give super thanks, with contributions of up to $20.